Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day you are choosing to watch this set of videos. This is our final set if you are watching this for the oceanography class. So that's exciting, right? You don't have to worry about doing any more of these assignments or having to watch these and, do the little assignments that are associated with it. So that's exciting. In this set, we're going to look at finish up biology, basically. So we're going to finish up looking at the deep ocean floor and some habitats that we see around there. And then the very last concept of biology is diving into something called symbiosis. So that will be the second video. Something that we will cover in class together if we have time is, I just want to touch on some of the environmental issues from chapter 15. We're not officially going to cover that chapter because we've kind of weaved those ideas in previous lessons. But I very much encourage you to at least take a peek through chapter 15. It goes through more of these issues in finer detail, especially if you have any sort of interest in any environmental problems. So with that, let's get on into it. I do also want to remind you, just before I make my face small, of my final due date, right? For my final late work deadline is for any assignments that I'm allowing late work is this week, right? It's this Sunday. If you're watching this in spring of 2024, that is Sunday, May 19th at 11:59. So if you're watching this in another semester, then just be sure to pay attention to the actual date of my deadline. So hard stop deadline, which includes the smart book reading assignments as well. So don't delay on those, as I've reminded us all semester long. Alrighty, so lecture 33, let's get into it. So the deep sea floor. When we left each other in class, I finished talking about coral reefs and deep sea coral. So that was kind of our little introduction into the deep sea floor as a whole. So the deep sea floor characterized is the largest benthic habitat, right? Because we're thinking of anything that's not along a coastline, pretty much anything that does not get light. Available light, sunlight gets scattered way too much before it can reach the bottom of the floor. So in this case, the habitats consist of abyssal plains, which remember we talked about back in when we talked about continental margins and stuff like that, almost like our second lesson, trenches and slopes of mid-ocean ridges, and also things like seamounts and stuff. But the way I want you to think about mid-ocean ridges and trenches is literally underwater mountains, right? So if you look out to our coastal mountains here, or if you look up at the Sierra Nevada mountains, just imagine all of that, all of those ridges and bumps and trees and creatures just underwater, right? Obviously different types of creatures and stuff like that, but I want us to really try to envision and imagine that it's literally underwater mountains. It's not smooth and straight. It's, bumpy and dynamic. So the deep ocean floor is also, of course, extremely cold and dark. At some point at about 1 kilometer down, the whole ocean kind of gets into this homeostasis, or a homogeneous sort of state in terms of salinity values as well as temperature, about between 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, right? But it is not devoid of life. And we are learning more and more and more about the deep ocean every single time we do a dive, which is really, really cool. And we're finding that there's actually a lot of life along the ocean floor. So this kind of goes into the constant need to continuously look at our oceans, right? And investigate our oceans. So because of these very stable conditions, those homogeneous sort of conditions, this has actually favored deposit feeding in fauna creatures of many different types of species. So filter feeding in a sense, right? So remember we talked about coral. Coral consists of polyps, and those polyps have little arms on them basically, and they feed whatever comes through the water, right? So a lot of different species like that on the ocean floor as well. And then epifauna do exist also. So if those terms infauna and epifauna are I don't remember what that is, be sure to go back and review those terms at the beginning of this chapter. So what's also really interesting is most creatures in the deep ocean are pretty small. Because there's not a lot of food, they don't grow very big, right? But something called deep sea gigantism also occurs, but it's not really fully understood like how that happens or why that happens. It's a bit of a puzzle for scientists to try to figure out. So we also, in the deep sea floor, we have like kind of biology hotspots, if you will. So we're going to divide those up into hydrothermal vent habitats, cold seeps, and whale falls. So this here is a map from your book indicating the currently identified vents and cold seeps and whale falls. There, of course, could be way more than what is exhibited on this particular map, but we have only studied so much of the ocean floor, right? So I really want you to consider and maybe even pull up a map of plate boundaries and really try and see where some of these habitats are in relation to where the plate boundaries are at, right? So where are these hydrothermal vents generally located? What type of plate boundary is there? And could there be any sort of connection between the two, which I think is really quite fascinating. So I'm going to focus on these two habitats of hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. We've talked about whale falls already, so you can refer back to marine mammals and whale falls and even nutrients, right? And when we talked about primary productivity and what are some ways that nutrients can be inserted into the oceans, dead things fall, stuff like that. And notice that one of them is over here, right, in the Monterey Bay Canyon, which is kind of cool. So starting with hot vents. So recognize and recall that the deep ocean, no light, right? So they have to rely on chemosynthesis in order to gain energy. So in this case, we find hot vents and hydrothermal vents kind of all over, generally found around the spreading centers, right? So again, going back to that previous map and looking at where those things are occurring, those are on divergent boundaries. So it's basically really hot water and basically underwater volcanoes, hydrothermal vents, which again, we've talked about before, but occurring where plates are coming apart. What's really fascinating is there's all different kinds of animals found around or near vents. So in this picture here, you can see these really beautiful red tube worms. You can see crabs. Kind of hard to see, but there are some fish that are kind of floating around in here. And so these are generally filter feeding animals. Not entirely, but generally. Also notice the overall kind of lack of color. The crabs are white. The only color here that we tend to see, or that I am seeing, is the tube worms, right? Which is really quite fascinating. Something you probably won't find around hot vents are coral. They don't really need this energy, so they're still filter feeders, but maybe the environment is just not suited for deep sea coral here in this particular case. So we also have cold seeps. So in this case, bacteria are actually the primary producers, and they use the methane and hydrogen sulfide as nutrients. So basically what's happening here is there's faults on the ocean floor that fracture the sea floor, which then results in this oil and gas leakage into the water. And so we have then classified that as a cold seep. In this case, you can also find a huge variety of animals, large biodiversity, still kind of like these worm little things, a big old crab down here, maybe even an isopod, kind of hard to, looks crabby to me though. And then you can also kind of see some of the bacteria and stuff in kind of the muck and the murk and the mud. So really quite fascinating. And also recall when we talked about the beginning of life, at the very, very beginning of our time together, we talked about where life likely started in the deep oceans, and it probably started from this sort of hot vent or cold seep region, which is really quite neat because again, didn't need photosynthesis yet. We were simply relying on chemicals. So here's just a picture or a set of pictures looking at different organisms found along the deep sea floor. We have things like different types of coral and anemones. There's soft coral and hard coral. This is also by a cold seep, by the way, this little nugget right here. So a really, really beautiful representation of deep sea coral. Notice how it's also devoid of color because, again, it doesn't have zooanthely. So it doesn't have the pretty colors that we would generally see in tropical sea coral. Little crabby here, some tube worms. These are types of mussels or clams on cold seeps as well, and also little shrimpies on them. This is a sea sponge, which is not like a type of coral, but it is still a living thing. And a Japanese spider crab, which you can see in the Monterey Bay live streams, pretty cool. And this is an example of a deep sea giant isopod. So that is one of the versions of of deep sea gigantism that we don't often, or that we don't know why they are so large. So the deep sea floor in all of its beauty and glory and vastness is still, of course, largely unexplored. So again, really driving home this idea that we need to continuously further understand the deep sea floor, mostly because we are trying to find resources to mine and do deep sea mining, which is real not good. So if you like your EV cars, we need lithium and cobalt and nickel, and we're running out of resources, or the resources on land are, kind of monopolized by some regions or different countries or whatever, or they're incredibly unethical. So trying to understand the deep sea floor better so we can protect these environments from things like deep sea mining, which kind of, again, goes back into environmental issues. So that's the deep sea floor. In the next video, we will look at symbiosis. Thank you so much for your time and attention and for watching.